Welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast. My name is Anthony Oliver, and today we're going to tackle a vital but too often overlooked area of infrastructure delivery, namely commissioning, the art and science of getting assets ready to deliver the outcomes required from the investment. It is indeed a vital activity for every infrastructure professional to be aware of, for every asset owner and project sponsor for that matter, because while the results of getting commissioning right are so often unnoticed, the impact of getting it wrong can be commercially, socially, environmentally and politically disastrous. Too often fantastic infrastructure projects fall at the final hurdle by either opening late or having to close immediately after opening for retrofit or repair. Others fail to deliver the outcomes to expectation, or they see costs spiral as teams rally and race to meet the commercial promises of opening dates. In the UK, we might think about delays to the opening of the Jubilee line extension, Crossrail or West Coast Mainline, while signalling was wrestled with. Think baggage handling problems on Heathrow Terminal Five. Think signal and power issues on the Channel Tunnel rail link. The list goes on, and usually the problem simply comes down to a lack of thought, time, investment and prioritisation for the commissioning process. Those vital steps that make assets ready for operation. But it doesn't have to be that way. In fact, according to the Industrial Commissioning Association, the more that the people working on projects understand the importance of commissioning and the value it provides, the more successful projects will be in meeting their cost, schedule and quality objectives. So let's hear more about this very attractive proposition and find out about the opportunities and what's holding us back by welcoming Paul Turner, Chief Executive of the Industrial Commissioning Association, the man who's driving the organisation forward after a career spent wrestling with the commissioning process around the world.
Thanks for having me, and I'm excited to share some information with your audience.
Brilliant. Well, let's get straight into it. I mean, the ICA is about to launch a new report on good commissioning, and we'll talk about that report a bit later on. But to kick off this conversation, Paul, how would you describe the importance of good commissioning?
The importance of good commissioning really comes down to that mindset of starting with the end in mind. The earlier you can engage commissioning expertise into your project, then the more planning and coordination with all disciplines taking place on the project, it's going to result in a better outcome on the project. When planning is taking place for design activities, when planning is taking place for construction activities, this is really the time when planning needs to be taken for commissioning activities in order that all aspects of the project are planned and coordinated so that they can successfully come together in the end. What we see in a lot of projects is there's a focus on design and there's a focus on construction, but commissioning doesn't get planned or even thought about until later in the project, like a few months maybe before on-site testing starts. Well, by that point in the project, all of the design and construction activities has been planned and a lot of it has been executed, but that doesn't necessarily align with what's needed for a strong and successful finish at the end of the project. So the message that the ICA is trying to put forward out there is that there really is a need to have commissioning involved earlier in projects for that successful planning element.
Yeah, I suppose making sure it's not the poor relation to the whole project delivery process. So Paul, you're joining me today from your base in Canada. Why is Canada at the heart of good commissioning? Is that just a coincidence, or have you got some really good way of doing things over there?
So the hotbeds for commissioning in North America are in Houston, Texas, and in Calgary, Alberta, largely led by the oil and gas industry. When you're reaching out and discussing with people online, that's where you're going to find a lot of commissioning people. So there's a large concentration in those two areas. Where I'm in Manitoba is actually a hotbed for HVDC. All our power generation is at the opposite end of our province. So we've got some long HVDC links that bring power to the southern end of the province here. And that's where I got a lot of my experience with commissioning, is in the power industry. So I wouldn't necessarily say that one country has perfected the approach to commissioning over the other. I think it's a challenge worldwide, and everybody's struggling with finishing these complex projects. And the more that we can share information globally to help people understand this complex phase, it's going to help projects achieve better outcomes.
But I suppose the reality, Paul, is that in the oil and gas sector and in the energy generation sector, there is a really, really strong correlation between finishing the project and starting to generate revenue. It's in everyone's interest to really make sure that the process comes online as quick as possible and smoothly as possible. Would you say that by comparison, infrastructure remains a step or two behind?
The oil and gas industry has certainly been a leader in application of commissioning best practices for obvious reasons. There's legitimate safety hazards. There's lots of money involved. Working on offshore oil platforms definitely requires an organized and structured approach to all aspects of the project, including commissioning. So oil and gas has certainly been a leader in that regard. There's still lots of challenges for sure. Some of the other industries outside of oil and gas, power industry, water treatment, other infrastructure projects, they haven't maybe had so much of a focus on commissioning as the oil and gas industry has, and maybe one or two steps behind. For example, the oil and gas industry has very much adopted the need to use commissioning software, and that's been used for a few decades to help manage the completion of projects. But a lot of other projects outside of oil and gas, we see that they haven't necessarily made that step and are still using spreadsheet processes to manage commissioning. And projects have just gotten so complex. There's so much information involved that we need to be using these software tools, these systems, to manage this crushing amount of information. And we need to help some of these projects that are still kind of stuck in the Excel era from 40 years ago make that step to more modern systems to manage all this information.
So when you talk about what makes commissioning succeed and what makes commissioning fail, there's clearly a lot of technical solutions that you can bring to play there. So does it simply come down to a lack of investment, or is the problem more cultural? Do we lack the mindset that actually makes commissioning an investment priority?
All of the technical problems that you're going to encounter on projects, those are the easy problems to solve, right? We've got lots of smart engineers and there's lots of technical solutions to these technical problems. We can solve all the technical problems. The challenge, like you're kind of indicating there, is that it's a cultural or an adaptation issue to get people to adapt to these new ways of working, right? And I think it's just a lack of understanding. Commissioning is complex, and we can't fault anybody for not understanding a complex topic like commissioning. Not everybody is going to be an expert in commissioning. And even when we just use the term commissioning, if you ask 10 different people what commissioning is, you probably get 10 different answers because it can refer to a lot of things, right? Often people use the term commissioning thinking it's referring to testing that takes place at the end of the projects, not understanding that it's a project management process that spans the entire duration of the project. And I think that's a lot of the cases when we say we need early commissioning involvement. People say, well, why do we need testing at the beginning of our project? There's nothing to test. And that's not the message that we're trying to convey, but there is definitely a commissioning project management role that exists at the beginning of project. And that commissioning project manager is what we're advocating needs to be involved early in the project so that commissioning managers can work with design managers, can work with construction managers and project managers. And this group of leaders, including commissioning, can plan for successful commissioning later in the project.
Right. So it's that whole process across the duration of the project that commissioning needs to be thought about, not just something that's glued on at the end of the project. So would you say that this is where the typical failures are seen in infrastructure projects? Because commissioning is just not prioritised, that it's slapped on, I suppose, at the end as a kind of afterthought.
That's it. Yeah. With that perception that commissioning is really testing, well, then that's what leads people to think, yeah, we're going to test everything at the end. We need to get construction done before we test it, right? But there's a whole element of planning, just like planning for design and just like planning for construction. There's a planning element for commissioning to make sure that this very complex phase goes well. And it must be planned in conjunction with design planning and construction planning. You can't plan only 2/3 of your project and then figure out the last third towards the end. That's never going to lead to everything coming together. Is there's going to be missing design deliverables and later missing construction deliverables. And it's not anybody's fault. They're working to what's specified in contracts. But when they don't have that crystal clear picture of what success looks like during commissioning right from the beginning of the project, then it's hard for them to target those goalposts because they haven't been defined.
Great. Well, let's talk a bit about the ICA. Actually, or is it the ICXA? I mean, that's how your website describes it. I mean, how do you pronounce it?
I would use ICXA, but a lot of people will drop the X and say ICA. So whatever works, we can use ICA.
Okay, good. I'm just thought I'd get that out in the open. So it's a fairly new organisation. It's global. So what prompted you to set it up? I mean, give me the backstory.
It is a fairly new organization. We've been providing commissioning training for quite some time, for many years, in helping people that are maybe more experienced with the technical aspects of commissioning move up and become more of that management role of commissioning. But through the years, it's become quite clear, and what companies are asking for is that standardized approach to commissioning, that baseline to be achieved for this commissioning project management role, with a real certification program, a very hard exam to pass to qualify that individuals can meet this very important role that needs to exist at the beginning of projects. So that's been the transition over the last little bit, is to build out a bigger certification program and baseline global commissioning standard to define best practices for commissioning. And that's what we've been working on for the last little while to push that initiative forward.
So that's, I suppose, what you describe as the overarching purpose of ICXA. It's about providing some standards that the industry can gather around.
That's right. And there's been bits and pieces of commissioning standards over the years. Some of them have maybe been internal company proprietary standards of how they do commissioning. There's been other smaller aspects that maybe aren't quite as complete and descriptive of what commissioning should be. But really what the industry is lacking is that standardized approach on industrial plant process projects. And that's what ICA is going forward to develop, is that global standard that's missing, and a certification program to basically certify people to that level that they're performing projects with best practices that meet this standard.
And you've got about 1,800 members, that's individuals and firms, and it's free to join. But what do firms and individuals get for their membership? How do you get that knowledge out there?
Membership has been growing quite quickly, so there's definitely a gap in the industry. There's lots of interest in understanding what this complex phase of projects is for commissioning. A lot of it's been outreach on social media, doing podcasts such as this, getting information out there, participating in industry seminars from other organizations, construction organizations, and major project associations such as that. That's the only way that I know to help get this information in the right hands, is with communication and information. I don't see any government regulations that are coming forward to step in and help the industry figure this out. The industry has to figure it out on its own, and the only way to do that is with information and sharing and making things available for people. And that's why we've made membership free to join ICA, is we need to get this information in the hands of the right people as easily as possible. A lot of groups have put their standards or information behind a paywall. Well, that's just a barrier or another layer of friction to try and get this information out there. Membership is free to join. All of the information, standards, resources to help people figure out this complex topic, everything's in there to make it as easy as possible.
Right, yeah. And of course, that really speaks to the first of your three guiding principles to provide access to industry best practice for commissioning. And your second guiding principle is to create commissioning competency. The CXPM designation ensures the best qualified resources are engaged to ensure project success. So how do you define that? Is it about offering training? Is it also about certifying people? I mean, so who is qualified to judge whether you are a certified commissioning manager?
So the way we're developing that is with industry partners. We've developed a global network of industry experts that are collaborating to develop this global commissioning standard. So that will define the baseline standard of what defines best practices for commissioning. Once that standard's developed, then we'll be developing a certification program where people know and understand, recognize the standard, and can execute projects to that standard. A very important part of commissioning is experience. Being on the project, hands-on, touching, feeling the equipment, and dealing with the issues firsthand is the best way to master commissioning and become an expert over years. So that's the second aspect of determining someone's competency for commissioning is, first, do they understand the standard and best practices? And second, do they have the experience on projects, 1 year, 5 year, 12 years, whatever, to demonstrate the application of these best practices on projects.
And I suppose they have to have the scars to prove that they've been there, so to speak.
That's right. Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. Well, finally, the third ICXA guiding principle is to provide commissioning advocacy. So how do you go about that? How do you describe that advocacy? Is it basically just championing and telling asset owners that they really should think about this harder?
So there's been lots of organizations that support the building commissioning industry, and they've been doing great work providing support for building systems, commercial systems, HVAC, test and balance. Those have been around for quite some time. There are lots of other organizations that support the construction industry, but there's never really been a group or organization to support more complex commissioning on industrial plant process energy systems. So that's the gap we're attempting to fill here, is that advocacy to say that, yes, there's building commissioning, but there's also industrial plant process commissioning, exactly like you said, to take that message to companies, to project owners, to say, this is what commissioning really is. This is what it's all about. And this is why you need to engage commissioning earlier, because it can help your project succeed better in the end.
All of which, of course, you go through in your new report, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But before we do that, let's find a bit more about you, Paul. Let's take a quick look at your background. You're based in Winnipeg in Canada, which, if you're like me, you look it up on the map and you'll notice that it's pretty much slap bang in the middle between Toronto and Vancouver, in the heart of Canada. Some might say in the middle of nowhere. Well, it's in the middle of Canada anyway. You've had a 25-year career in project management and commissioning. So how do you describe the route to your current day job?
So I started my engineering career in the aerospace industry, building satellites and rockets for the Canadian Space Agency, working on payloads in the International Space Station. And that was a great experience. I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. After I left the aerospace industry and moved to the power industry, I didn't find that same level of attention on quality. In the aerospace industry, before we launch a satellite into space, there's a lot of testing that goes on. It has to work, right? Because after you launch your rocket, there's no reset switch. And I found
there's a couple of astronauts floating around up in space in the space station right now who could reinforce that message.
That's right. Yep. But I think on our ground-based projects, it's just too easy to run down the hall and press reset switch on your protection and control cubicle, right? And there becomes a reliance on that, and maybe less of a focus on quality. So I could see this gap where projects were struggling to complete, and they're complex projects. Building a wastewater treatment plant or a nuclear facility or an oil and gas platform, they're bigger, more complex, just as complex as launching a satellite into space, but a lot less of a success rate, where I think in some of your other podcasts, you refer to Bent Flibberg's research that 9 out of 10 projects are late and over budget. So there's definitely a challenge in these projects where I thought I could bring some of this aerospace experience and hopefully transfer it to our ground-based projects with a bigger attention to quality and more of an attention to success at the end of the project, which is commissioning. So that's kind of how my career has progressed. Now that I've had a bunch of experience in aerospace and power projects and water treatment, wastewater treatment plant projects, I've shifted my focus to helping the industry understand this complex topic of commissioning with the Industrial Commissioning Association. So lots of information generation, sharing online, attendance at conferences, podcasts, any way to help share information and get it out there so that people can understand the value of commissioning, with the goal that better commissioning processes are going to help us achieve better success rates on projects and hopefully move that needle to more than 1 out of 10 projects being successful.
Sounds like, getting commissioning right for you has been something of a life mission.
Yeah, I can see that it's certainly a big problem. It's challenging for sure. Maybe I'm crazy to try and help solve this problem in an industry that doesn't necessarily want help, but it is a significant problem for projects and for society in general. We have an incredible amount of infrastructure to build over the next several years. You look at reports like McKinsey just released a report last month. The current construction industry is $13 trillion, and by 2040, it's expected to double. There's an unprecedented amount of projects for decarbonization, for electrification, for all the infrastructure that we depend on behind the scenes to run our society. And it's almost like there's a hidden tax or a hidden burden on society because projects just aren't able to successfully finish on time and on budget. So the opportunity is massive to even just to make a small little impact to improve that productivity results in billions of dollars that can be redirected to other infrastructure projects and better uses of limited funds rather than just being wasted inefficiently on project completions.
Well, I mentioned you live in the middle of Canada, a beautiful, if remote part of the world. So what do you get up to, Paul, when you're not thinking about commissioning and inspiring others to do it better?
So you're right. We do live in a very beautiful part of Canada here. We do have very short summers, and we do enjoy our short summers in the few months when it's warm. But summers here are actually quite beautiful. So spending a lot of time at the cottage with the family, wakeboarding, water skiing, just relaxing at the lake is a great thing to do. And then in the winter in Western Canada, there's the Rocky Mountains, of course. We try to get out there as much as we can for snowboarding and skiing and have a great time with family and friends too.
All of which sounds pretty idyllic, Paul. I'm not a bit jealous at all about that. Well, let's move on. I mentioned your new report, which is set to be published this month. It's called Project Commissioning, Start with an End in Mind. So what are the headlines from that?
So the report is coming along well. It should be released here soon. Hopefully, when people are listening to this episode, it should be released. So definitely check it out on our website. You can go to icxa.net and there's a report section. You can read the report. The essence of the report is from two aspects: to give the message that early commissioning involvement is important, and the specifics of that being early involvement of your CXPM, your qualified commissioning project manager, right at the beginning of the project to work with design managers and construction managers to plan the entirety of the project. So that's the first message that the report is getting at. The second message is the development of a global standard and certification program to make resources available to fill this role. It's a common problem on all projects. Our wise commissioning experts are retiring and taking their knowledge with us. And due to the volume of projects that are coming upon us, there's a severe shortage of experienced expert commissioning managers that can fill these roles. So that's the second message of the report is how are we going to tackle that? How are we going to ensure that there's a steady pipeline of commissioning experts to fill this critical leadership role at the beginning of projects? Because
what you're aiming at is ultimately, as you say, is developing a strong plan to finish projects with a robust commissioning process. So how do you describe this robust commissioning process?
A robust commissioning process is definitely a systems-based approach. A lot of the time when projects start, project managers have been trained to develop your WBS and break down the work accordingly there. And that's great to align with how design or construction would do the work, but that doesn't necessarily align with a systems-based approach of how the project is going to be commissioned and started up at the end. So starting early, starting with a systems-based approach and managing your gated commissioning process right from the start is critical to establishing a robust commissioning process. Without that, then the transition from construction to commissioning becomes quite difficult and unstructured, unorganized. And that's where you see a lot of tensions on projects. And it doesn't have to be that way when you plan in advance for groups to work together collaboratively, then that transition can go much more smoothly.
Well, looking forward, around the globe, more and more infrastructure is needed to drive growth and improve lives. But it's an interesting moment, Paul, because the oil and gas industry is being radically changed as it transitions towards renewable energy generation and electrification around the world. So do you see any new specific challenges when it comes to getting this new energy transition infrastructure up and running?
Definitely, yeah. The oil and gas industry is undergoing a change. We're still going to have oil and gas for many decades ahead of us, and there's lots of oil and gas projects that are still in development. LNG projects are in high demand these days because of the lower carbon footprint. So there's a couple LNG plants in Western Canada that are being built, one that's just being finished and one that's just being started. There might be another one even on the east coast of Canada that's in development in the US as well. So LNG projects are quite big. Electrification is a huge challenge as well. There's lots of HVDC projects more so in Europe than there is in North America, but HVDC is undergoing a huge expansion in North America. There's several projects in the queue that are in development and will be built over the next few years. More projects than even the manufacturers can provide, and certainly more projects than there is HVDC experts that can build these projects.
So getting the power to where it's needed effectively.
Exactly. Yeah. When you're building solar or you're building offshore wind, then HVDC comes into play there to transport anything over 600 kilometers would typically be HVDC just for efficiency to transport that energy. So there's lots of renewable projects in the works that are going to therefore require HVDC to get the power into the right place. So the supply chains that are being established for EV batteries, there's lots of projects there for hydrogen, blue hydrogen, green hydrogen. There's just a massive amount of projects. There's a huge element to invest here to develop all of these, and we need to make sure that these trillions of dollars is spent wisely rather than just being inefficiently wasted on projects.
And as you say, it's about thinking in systems rather than in individual projects. It's about programs for energy transition rather than individual projects. Yet one thing that's consistent about UK project delivery, well, global project delivery for that matter, is that it never goes to plan in terms of achieving the desired outcomes. Well, it rarely goes to plan in terms of delivering those desired outcomes. So what are some of the key lessons that you can bring from your experience to help us to avoid those mistakes of the past?
The number one key lesson, if people are listening and there's only one thing that you take away from this discussion, is early involvement of commissioning. Ignore all the details, the pre-commissioning, commissioning, startup, all that. If there's one thing you focus on, is engage your commissioning project manager right from the beginning of your project. That individual will take care of all the nitty-gritty details that people don't want or necessarily need to understand, but engaging that key leadership role for commissioning at the beginning of the project is the best lessons learned, and commissioning folks have been saying that for a long time. That's the message we need to get forward, is that project owners, project investors get a significant value by involving this leadership role for commissioning at the beginning of projects.
It's hard though, because it requires owners to invest up front for something which they're not going to reap the benefits of, until maybe a decade later down the road. How do you persuade those owners to invest in those processes early?
And that is the challenge for sure, right? Because in your project estimate, there's a line for cost for commissioning guys and software and whatever, and someone can add that number up, right? But there's no corresponding line that says money saved from commissioning, right? There's no link, and people don't see that. But you have to know that anything you can do to complete projects more efficiently is going to save money. And that's what commissioning is about with a well thought out plan. If you can save a day, a week, a bit of time at the end of the project, that's usually pretty valuable, because the end of the project is crunch time. The daily burn rate of the project is quite high. So anything you can do to make that process more efficient and finish on time is certainly going to save money, way more than the cost of hiring one or two individuals a bit earlier in your project.
Well, just to finally wrap up, Paul, give us a bit of advice for those infrastructure owners thinking about embarking on a major infrastructure project. What are your top tips to actually make that case for investment in commissioning early?
The challenge is always, when you're thinking about that investment, then where are you going to get these people? And I'm sure a lot of project owners have been burned in the past, where they've been told this message to involve commissioning earlier, and they maybe don't get the right skill set at the beginning. It's maybe more of that testing skill set. Testing thought is, we need to bring someone earlier. And if they've brought that particular skill set early in the project, they probably didn't see the return on investment or value from it, right? But when you get an experienced commissioning project manager, that leadership role at the beginning of your project, that's where you're going to get the return on your investment, because that's the leader that's going to work with your other design leaders and your construction leaders to plan the entirety of your project and plan for success at the end.
Great. That's fantastic advice, Paul. Thanks very much. Really interesting topic and really hugely challenging. But I suppose the point you make is a lot of it is just pretty much common sense. It's thinking about things in advance, thinking about things as systems rather than just simple single processes. So I suppose the other thing you probably would advise is that people go to your website and find out more information about joining the organisation.
For sure, yeah. Happy to share some information. And if anybody wants to learn more about the initiatives that we're undertaking, you can go to our website at icxa.net and see the reports, see the membership, see the certification programs we're working on. And if you'd like to get involved, then please reach out.
Okay, well, thanks so much for joining me on the Infrastructure Podcast today to give us your thoughts and analysis.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Well, sadly, that's all we've got time for today, but we do have more from the Infrastructure Podcast in the pipeline and more guests to talk to as we continue to probe the big issues faced across the sector. If you haven't done so already, do check out the Infrastructure Podcast website. That's www.infrastructure-podcast.com, where you'll find background links to all of the issues discussed today, and I'll include some links to some of the reports that Paul's mentioned today. But there's also the latest podcast to listen to and to share with colleagues. So thanks for joining us, and thanks again to Paul. I look forward to seeing you again very soon.